Hello, everybody. So, this is a recording for session 9 of the modern age. I'm going to be discussing today the second part of the reading of The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. I want to do a quick review before I get into the third chapter called The Abolition of Man. Remember that each chapter are separate lectures that he gave. So, let me do a quick review really fast. Remember that the beginning of the book started with C.S. Lewis talking about modern education, and he used the example of a book called, which he called at least, the Green Book, written by Titus and Gaius. And he's essentially blaming modern educators for miseducating children and stripping them of their childhood, stripping them of the ability to think rationally or to think critically about the world. And the way that they do that is by reducing values to mere sentiments and saying that somebody needs to rationalize through the sentiments because people are too sentimental. The emotions are taken too seriously. This is the charge that modern educators give against modern society. So the way he phrases it is that, well, he gives the example of the waterfall, if you remember. Things don't have intrinsic value, and he gives the example of the waterfall. When people see a waterfall, actually this is from the book, the Green Book, they give the example of the waterfall. When somebody sees a waterfall and they say, oh, it's splendid, it's beautiful, what modern educators say is that the waterfall itself is not beautiful in and of itself. This is just the feelings that arise in the psychology of the person that's viewing it, which has no relation to the thing itself. So there is no intrinsic beauty which the mind is conforming to. Rather, it's the mind that is imposing itself on something and calling it beautiful. And so things don't have intrinsic value in themselves, and this is what Lewis is decrying essentially in this book. So he says that there's an excessive rationalism that is killing, things like imagination and whatnot. And this is very relevant, obviously, to us because the modern age is marked by the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is marked by an excessive rationalism. Everything is just like what Kant said, right? A critique of pure reason. Everything we know things a priori. We know knowledge in an a priori way. It's in our mind. We just have to rationalize through it using logic and whatnot. This is a problem for C.S. Lewis because you can't rationalize everything. There are first principles that people like Plato talked about, people like Aristotle talked about, people from the Christian tradition, from the Hindu tradition, all these ancient, classical, traditional ways of thinking about the world has a form of first principles, or what we can call the natural law, or what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao, Tao. So you can't rationalize everything. And one of the examples that he gives is dying for one's country. How can you rationalize dying for one's country? Well, some rationalists will say, well, it's good to die for your own country, self-sacrifice, because it's good to preserve society. But then how can you rationalize why is it good to preserve society? And why should I be the one that sacrifices myself for the preservation of society, which I haven't even been able to prove rationally yet? So he gives all these examples, and essentially criticizing an excessive rationalism because it doesn't work. Things are valuable, and we have to sit and view them, perceive them in a kind of awe and wonder, and understand our kind of collective appreciation of things like nature and things that are in creation as first principles that we don't really philosophize through, but that we all kind of intuitively understand. This is what Aristotle called first principles, and the example that he gave is the whole is greater than the part, right? And you can't rationalize through that, you just know it. And if somebody can't agree on first principles, everything is going to be left to mere opinion. And that's kind of the problem that C.S. Lewis is talking about. And this is what leads to the abolition of man, which we get to in the chapter that we read for this discussion. So he begins the third lecture, the abolition of man, with the idea of the domination of nature. Human beings want now to dominate nature, to have power over nature. But this is not true power for C.S. Lewis. It's the power of some people over the power of everybody else. And those few people are people like innovators, people that invent things that we use, and that they end up exercising power over us because they're the ones that decide how we're going to use their product, which we buy. So some people can figure out how to have domination over nature. Some people can figure out how to have power over the world. And those few people might give you that power if they want to, like if you want to buy the products that give you that power, or if they don't want to. So it's people that will sell you their products and decide whether or not they will sell you their products and for how much. The examples that he gives are airplanes. Well, he says airplanes, wireless, which I'm pretty sure means the radio, and contraception. There were no cell phones in 1944. So the domination of nature for C.S. Lewis doesn't mean that mankind as a whole has domination over nature, because we can't talk about just one collective man. We're individuals at the end of the day, and it's some people have domination over other people, and that's the result of what we call man's domination of nature. It's some men's domination over nature and over other people. So one of the examples is contraception. It's the contracepting generation which has power over the next generation, because they're the ones that get to decide how many people will come into existence in the next generation. And there's a kind of retroactive power that is being exercised on the generation that follows by way of contraception. So he kind of challenges the progressive movement by saying progress doesn't take care of this problem of power over other people. And this is what he says. I'll read to you a little bit from page 56 in my book. He says this: in order to understand fully what man's power over nature, and therefore the power of some men over other men, really means, we must picture the race extended in time from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction. Each generation exercises power over its successors, and each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors. This modifies the picture, which is sometimes painted, of a progressive emancipation from tradition and a progressive control of natural processes, resulting in a continual increase of human power. In reality, of course, if any one age really attains, by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. So it's in this way that the master, he uses the word master generation, the generation which has freed itself from all previous generations. The argument that he's making is that previous generations have some power over the generation that comes after it, because they're the ones that shape the environment. They're the ones that shape the kind of culture. They're the ones that shape the generation that's being born by shaping the world that is leading to the next generation. When one generation comes around and decides to be progressive, progress in this sense means having more power, and more power in this sense means being freed from the power of the generation that came before it. But ultimate power is going to be free from the generation that came before it, and free from losing power to the next generation. And C.S. Lewis, this is where he starts to talk about eugenics and scientific education to make its descendants what it pleases. And to make machines that we decide how they're going to use. That master generation will have freed itself from its predecessors by freeing itself from tradition, and will have gained power over its successive generation by determining its number by way of contraception and its mode of existence, the way that it lives, the way that it operates, by way of technology. In this way, the last generation, after the master generation, will be the slave of all other generations and will have lost all freedom. And so, for C.S. Lewis, there's no simple advance in man's power. It's not like, a numerical series of number. It's not like power continues to increase as generations go on. But there is a limit to that power. And it's that limit to that power that he is criticizing here. There's no simple advance in man's power, since man gains power over men. It's not just power over nature. It becomes more powerful and weaker at the same time. So he goes on to say, page 59, if you're reading the same version as me, I'm only making clear what man's conquest of nature really means, and especially that final stage in the conquest, which perhaps is not far off. The final stage is come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, and by an education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. So for C.S. Lewis, the battle will be won when man has gained power to make human nature whatever he wants it to be, when man can kind of reinvent himself according to his own image, according to his own desires. But then he asks the question, who's going to win? If man has full domination over nature, or man, which means a few men have ascertained for themselves power over everybody else, who will have won? Man's power over nature means some men's power over other men, which means the power of man to make himself what he pleases. The power of some men to make other men what they please. And that's, at the end of the day, what the domination or the conquering of nature really means. That some people, few people, have the power over other people and have the power to make those other people and nature itself what they want it to be. Because remember, nothing has intrinsic value. So it's not as if we are reshaping nature according to its own principles, but we are reshaping nature, reinventing nature and ourselves according to our own principles. But when you go outside, for C.S. Lewis, when you go outside of the Tao, when you go outside of natural law, our own principles are not going to be some standard that the whole human race has lived by, which is what we would call the Tao. What then does it have to be? He's going to say it's going to have to be emotions. I'm going to get there in a second. He says that the educationalists, like Plato, this is where he kind of criticizes Plato. If you remember from the Republic, Plato says that in the perfect society, children won't have parents. Everybody will belong to the state. As soon as the child is born, he's going to be stripped from his mother, and he's going to be given over to the state to be raised by random people, so that nobody has these kind of emotional bonds with one another, and everybody can be loyal to the city-state. So the educationalists like Plato, who says that we shouldn't have parents, Eliot, not T.S. Eliot, Eliot with a Y, who says that no men before 7, and that the children shouldn't see any men before the age of 7, and shouldn't see any woman after that. And Locke, who says that we shouldn't have poetry, will get what they want. So Locke is a, kind of a radical rationalist, is a product of the Enlightenment, says that we shouldn't have poetry, it's too imaginative. Page 60, C.S. Lewis says, we may thank the beneficent obstinacy of real mothers, real nurses, and above all, real children for preserving the human race in such sanity as it still possesses. So this is where he's criticizing pure rationalism, which would do away with the family, it would do away with human relations, it would do away with poetry, it would do away with imagination, it would do away with all these intellectual tools that go beyond mere material understanding of the world and see behind it some principle which is beautiful. He makes a bigger point where he says in the older systems, everybody ascribed to the Tao and raised children in the nest of this system. They raised children in this kind of safe haven of natural law. But now values they don't have intrinsic value, they're just merely natural phenomena. Judgments of values are to be produced in the student as far as part of the conditioning. So it's these conditioners. This is what he calls the conditioners, or also the innovators. These are people that are, we would call today social engineers, people that are socially engineering society. The conditioners manipulate the Tao. They reinvent it and they condition humanity into it. This is by way of re-education. What kind of Tao? What is the Tao going to be if there is no Tao? What kind of natural law is there going to be if we've done away with all traditional values, if we've done away with the wisdom of the ancients? The Tao is going to be merely whatever they please. And this is how he's proving his premise. He's saying the premise is that the conquering of nature really means the power of some men, few men, over everybody else. And his kind of proof statement for that, or his proposition for that, is to say, well, if we don't have a natural law system, if we don't believe in intrinsic values, if we don't have the Tao, then by what standard are these few men who have power over everybody else going to reinvent society? By what standard are they going to educate children? It's going to be by the standard of their own pleasure. It's going to be the desires of individual people, of a few people, that is going to rule over everybody else. And then he uses many words to say, I'm not saying, he's not making a value judgment on this. He's not saying that these people are evil people. He's not saying that they're bad men. But this is where he says, in the Abolition of Man, this is where he says, they're not necessarily bad men, but they're not men at all. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void. It's not that these are evil people. Again, we can't use judgment statements or judgment values like good and evil, because we are now without values. We now have no standard. We now have no natural law by which to judge everything, anything that's being done or anything that is planned. And without these values, without the Tao, we have also done away with standard, common human nature. And so, it's not that they're bad men. We can't use the word bad anymore because we don't know between good and bad. We have rejected good and bad. We've rejected good and evil. They're not bad men. They're not men at all. If you stand outside of the Tao and we have no value system, people are just blobs of atoms. And if people are just mere blobs of atoms, then you can manipulate them as you wish, as you desire. By what standard will the conditioners reshape blobs, the blobs of humanity? Well, by this, they're going to make humanity look like whatever they want it to look like. This is what Lewis is saying. If you stand outside the Tao and you treat fellow men as objects to be manipulated, how can the conditioner or the planner or the innovator know what to manipulate? The conditioners must be motivated by their own pleasure. Why will the conditioners act if they have no duty or no felt obligation to preserve the species? Again, this is going back to his earlier idea. If we have no first principles, why should we do anything? Why should we do anything? How can we rationalize doing anything by some standard or some moral or ethical standard, if there is no moral or ethical standard, because there's no intrinsic value in anything? Why would somebody do anything if there's no reason behind it, if there's no intrinsic rationale, ratio behind it? They wouldn't except if they were motivated by their own pleasures. All motives that claim any validity other than that of their felt emotional weight at a given moment have failed them. Everything except the sic volo, sic eubeo, that means as I will, so I command, has been explained away. Everything except for what I will is what I command, and the law is going to be whatever I want it to be, essentially tyranny, has been explained away. There is no rationale for anything except for tyranny when we are ruled by a few who rule according to their own desires. Gaining power over the world without reference to values, the Tao, turns the human race into matter to be manipulated. On a side note, there is a kind of modern application of this. I mean, there's a lot of modern applications of this in today's world, where human beings are just simply blob of atoms and just matter and can be manipulated according to the wishes of some, according to the experts, as we call them today. For example, when we say that people's emotional responses to things, or people's outlook on life, people's worldview, people's depression, is simply the result of a chemical imbalance, and that's it. When we explain everything away by way of firing neurons, chemical imbalances, what's implicit there is that the human person is not a person. He's just an assortment of material things, very, very, very tiny material things, but just an assortment of material things in the end. And depending on the way it's assorted will determine the way the human being will live his life. And depending on how these things are assorted and how they're ordered together will determine the quality of that person's life, whether they are, depressed or happy. What I'm not saying is that things like chemical imbalances are not real. Of course they are. What I'm not saying is that, I'm obviously not going to go into the whole thing about medicine as a treatment for clinical depression. I think medicine is good, it's fine, all that stuff. What I'm saying is when we reduce a human being to merely a set of chemical standards or a set of chemical assortments, then that's doing injustice to the human person. And I think at the end of the day, we're not properly treating the human person as a person. So those who have no inherent values cannot be motivated except by their desires and their emotions. If somebody doesn't have the Tao, then they'll want to rearrange society according to their own image as merely a means to following their own base animal instincts. And this is where C.S. Lewis turns it around and he says, well, if we live only according to our desires, or what they'll call instincts, because again, conscience is one of those things that is explained away rationally as merely a product of instinct. If we act only according to our instincts, our animal instincts, and the conditioners reinvent and reshape society, re-engineer society, only according to their pleasure and according to their desires, according to their instincts, then the conditioners go right back to nature. They become animals themselves and are ruled by nature again. And this is where C.S. Lewis turns it around and he says, human beings, we think that we can conquer nature, but in conquering nature, by way of having power over it, reinventing it, doing away with the Tao, doing away with natural standards, something that we abstract from the material universe, we end up ruling nature according to our own desires, which means that nature, our instincts, end up ruling us. So in our quest to conquer nature, we become conquered by nature. And he says this is on page 67. At the moment, then, of man's victory over nature, we find the whole human race subjected to some individual men, and those individuals subjected to that in themselves which is purely natural, to their irrational impulses. Man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. So this is a very interesting thing that he's saying here. Now he goes on to say, to talk about nature. What does nature really mean? Because we have to, for C.S. Lewis, when we strip intrinsic value from nature, it's no longer nature. It's no longer nature according to the classical definition. We have to reinvent nature. We have to redefine nature. We have to redefine nature as something which is conquerable. We have to redefine nature as something which we have conquered. And so he says, for example, I'll read it to you actually. It'll be easier. So this will be on page 70. We'll start on page 69. Now I take it that when we understand a thing analytically and then dominate and use it for our own convenience, we reduce it to the level of nature in the sense that we suspend our judgments of value about it, ignore its final cause, if any, and treat it in terms of quantity as opposed to quality, which would be a value judgment. This repression of elements in what would otherwise be our total reaction to it is sometimes very noticeable and even painful. Something has to be overcome before we can cut up a dead man or a live animal in a dissecting room. What he's saying is, in order to think merely rationally about something or analytically about something, and to see it as just an assortment of atoms, we have to overcome something so that we can dissect it. We have to overcome something so that we can dissect a dead man or a living animal. What do we have to overcome? We have to overcome this kind of felt, sentimental, I don't like using the word sentimental today because it has a different meaning than I think what C.S. Lewis is using it as, but call it a felt experience, a felt emotional response, a felt value judgment that we naturally ascribe to something. When we see a dead man, we see it as, we respect it in a sense. We see it as something belonging to a person. It's not just an assortment of matter. It's not just a blob. The body of a dead man, we bury it, we treat it, we embalm it, we do all these kinds of things, and we even pray over it and then go to the cemetery and bury it and even visit that cemetery afterwards because it belongs to a person. It's still valuable. We have to get over something in order to dissect a dead man. These objects resist the movement of the mind, whereby we thrust them into the world of mere nature. But in other instances, too, a similar price is exacted for our analytical knowledge and manipulative power, even if we have ceased to count it. So, to think merely rationally or in a rationalistic way about nature is to do away with some aspect of our personhood. It's to do with some aspect of our humanity in order to rationalize everything and reduce it to mere rationality, or what he's calling here mere nature. We have to do away with something, some very special part about our humanity. We do not look at trees either as dryads or as beautiful objects while we cut them into beams. The first man who did so may have felt the price keenly, the bleeding and the bleeding trees in Virgil and Spenser may be far off echoes of that primeval sense of impiety. Okay, so what he's saying is man naturally, or at least classical man, ancient people, used to have this kind of piety, used to kind of have this respect for even things like trees, which is why you have the dryads. The dryads are these mythological creatures that kind of take on human form, but that are the manifestation of trees. Trees are like these living people almost. We don't look at them as dryads any longer. We don't look at them as, we don't abstract the mere material from them anymore and see them as something more than mere matter. We don't look at them as dryads or as beautiful objects anymore when we cut them into beams. When we look at trees as merely things that we can utilize for our own comfort or our own benefit, we don't treat them as something to be respected any longer. We don't treat them as something beautiful any longer. We don't treat them as something with an imaginative force any longer. We just treat them as mere objects that serve a purpose for our own comfort and our own conveniences. And he says that the first people that did that probably had a hard time doing it, but as they did it, the more they did it, the easier it became. Is that a good thing? Or is that a dulling of the human conscience? Or is that a doing away with something valuable to the human spirit? The stars lost their divinity as astronomy developed. So, people used to look at the stars as gods. People used to look at the stars as, Thomas Aquinas even would have said that the stars are moved by angels. But the stars lost their divinity, or even their divine aspect, as astronomy developed. The second that we tried to understand nature from an analytical and a rationalistic perspective is the second that all of its beauty is stripped from it and all of its kind of divine origin is stripped from it. To many, no doubt, this process is simply the gradual discovery that the real world is different from what we expected, and the old opposition to Galileo or to the body snatchers is simply obscurantism. But that is not the whole story. It is not the greatest of modern scientists who feel most sure that the object, stripped of its qualitative properties and reduced to mere quantity, is wholly real. Little scientists and little unscientific followers of science may think so. The great minds know very well that the object so treated is an artificial abstraction, that something of its reality has been lost. So conquered nature is a redefinition, is the new definition of nature. Nature now means what we can conquer, what we can take over, what we can rationalize, what we can understand in an analytical way. True nature is no longer what the ancients thought it was, which is something that has intrinsic values, that something that has a divine origin, something that our minds must conform to have true knowledge and to appreciate and to live in and to live, in the kind of presence of. True nature now is just objective. It's just merely what we can use, what we can utilize, the way that we perceive it in a utilitarian way, but not something to be appreciated or something that is beautiful in and of itself. And this is again because we've done away with value. We've done away with the Tao. We've done away with natural law. This is where we can get into, well, let me say this really quick. He also talks about the magician and the scientist, and this is actually a really interesting point that I hadn't considered before, for sure. He says people charge the Middle Ages with being magical, or with being, with having a lot of magicians and being overly superstitious and whatnot. Magicians using matter in such a way that it would have some supernatural effect. Essentially, magicians use matter